Kirk, we really appreciate you coming on.
Yes.
We've been doing this podcast for a little over a year now. And just to give you a little background, so Amanda and I are kind of newer to birding, and we've been birding for about 2 years now, and met John and Shannon through the Field Museum, one of our birding trips, to like show us the collection. So we were actually kind of reading. This was a few years back, reading the Feather Thief as we were getting the tour, and so we really didn't know kind of the depth of everything and of the collection at the time, and so it was kind of fun, like literally reading your book as we're kind of seeing firsthand what the specimen collection at the Field Museum was like. So that was super cool for us, and so it seems like all of our episodes that we do, a lot of them we focus on a different bird. But it always kind of comes back to the collection. And so a lot of our listeners are always like asking, have you read The Feather Thief? And it kind of keeps coming back up. So the past month, we've kind of been doing a little mini series on the book and just doing like a book club between the four of us, and just kind of breaking down different sections of it. And so we were super thrilled that, when John reached out to you, that you were willing to come on, because it's kind of going to be the finale to our little mini series. And we've had so much fun. All four of us have gone back through and reread it, which has just been a blast. So just to give you a little
Oh, that's
backstory
cool.
on everything. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can't say no to anything that has any field museum connection. If it's not obvious, that was my childhood natural history museum. So first one I ever went to was a field museum. So it has a very special place in my heart. But also just that was partly I had to kind of change my whole mental framework because I would go on these class field trips and I only thought that the specimens they had were those that were on public display. So I didn't know anything about the larger collection. So anyways, I mean, I'm flattered that you guys have been talking about the book, and I'm eager to dive into it with you.
Awesome.
That's awesome. And you're from the Chicago area originally then. So you went to the Field Museum growing up and
I did. I'm
yeah.
from the appropriately named town of West Chicago, which is about 30 miles west of the city. And and so yeah, I mean our city field trips were either science and industry or the field museum, and then I ended up going to University of Chicago. So I mean, and my family is all still in Chicagoland. So I'm there pretty regularly. Next time I'm back, I'll reach out and we can keep the conversation going in person.
That's awesome.
Awesome.
I grew up in Glen Ellen, so just a few miles
Oh
from you. And so I
yeah,
think,
that's where my mom was born.
oh, no way.
Oh, sweet.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think I growing up did the same trips you did probably with my it was like every couple of years going into the Field Museum, Museum of Science and Industry, and I had the same experience going to the Field Museum. I thought everything that was out on display was everything until getting to know John and Shannon. So,
So I always like to point out that the tourist guides often have a phrase in them that says something like less than 1% of the specimens they have are on display. And when I'm giving tours behind the scenes, the one thing I'm always emphasizing to people, which certainly has meaning with respect to this book and what happened, is that, our idea is to have those be used by people and show people behind the scenes what's there and get that information out there. It's not that they're hidden away for nobody to actually experience them or do things with them.
Yeah, that was one of the kind of the points that I really wrestled with in the book was this. There is this kind of you can cultivate a sense of wonder and awe at all that has gone into the generations of curators that are protecting these things, that it makes you want to just build a huge castle wall around it and protect these things. But it's obviously not the true function of a natural history museum. And so it's easy for me on the sidelines to snipe and make criticisms, but I don't envy that balance that curators have to try to strike between affording access for the sort of propagation of knowledge versus protecting these things. And my wife always groans because in the wake of that book, I get emails pretty regularly from museums all over the world that are asking me if they should grant access to somebody that seems a little suspect, and they're asking if I happen to know is this guy a fly tire? Should we let them in? And that's an unpaid gig. Got some other things I need to do to pay the bills, but I can't not reply when they come in. And there have been some instances where I've had to reply to say I probably wouldn't let this guy in, just knowing what I know about them. But one of the other kind of, I guess, strange legacies of this book is that, and John, maybe you can attest to this, but a lot of museum heads have told me now that since the book has come out, they've put special locks on the species that are sort of itemized within the book on the feather thief species, basically, that they've updated the security procedures for any access to those, because a number of institutions weren't aware of just how valuable all of these things had become and how sort of vibrant the black market was. But I'm sure I'm telling you things you already all know better than I do at this point, but it's impossible to get into this story without just getting into every facet of it. So I'm going to shut up and you guys tell me what you want to talk about.
Oh, no.
Well, you inspired me to get into things on eBay that make my skin crawl that are still there.
Yeah.
And you can buy a pretty run-of-the-mill pheasant. It costs $2,000. And there's a lot of them.
The last I checked, it's been a little while, but there's quite a few protected species that I find on eBay and but I think one of the consequences of the book is that they're using more sort of code language and sort of jargon, and they also, I think, have gone deeper underground in that the private Facebook groups are much harder to get into now. They were all pretty, pissed off when they realized that I had been in their group the whole time, sort of taking screenshots. But I've also heard that the value of the most sought after specimens has quintupled since the book came out, in part because of the scarcity. The increased scarcity, that now the market has gone deeper underground, so it's harder to get them, and so it just costs more. So there has not been like a huge reckoning or reform or anything like that. It's the demand is still as pitched as ever.
Well, even the person who did it and got caught doesn't understand the severity of what he did, or at least won't say it publicly. So.
Yeah, you dropped out there. You said Edwin. You're talking about Edwin.
Yeah, he doesn't even acknowledge what he's done. Not publicly. I don't know what he's like behind the scenes, but I do think.
Yeah, I don't. Go ahead. Sorry.
What motivated him to talk to you? Do you think? Do you think he could kind of talk around you and make himself look okay, or what was going on there?
Well. Yeah, it's a source of sort of endless debate for people that have read the book, and for even my wife, my wife's a lawyer by training, and she was there for the interview, recording it, and I could sense her legal training. She was kind of leaning forward, being like, "All right, Edwin, don't answer this question. Like, this isn't." But fortunately, she didn't become his attorney, but I think one thing that I have learned as a nonfiction author now, especially as an investigative reporter, is that I'm generalizing here, but it seems more pronounced in men. But you put a microphone in front of somebody and you swing a spotlight on them and they want to talk, even if it's against their own interests. With Edwin, he avoided me or ignored me for years. I mean, it was, I think, over 3 years, 3 to 4 years before he finally agreed to speak. And that alone, I mean, most authors don't have that luxury to spend that much time. I mean, I was doing multiple things while I was working on the book, but I had the great fortune of basically waiting him out, waiting until enough time had passed. And at some point, the, the I think the scales tipped just a little bit in that my guess is that he probably saw public announcements of my book deal. And so I also told him I'm writing the book with or without you. And I think you should have every opportunity to respond to what I know or what I'm assuming. And if I'm way off, then you should have a right to tell me that. So that's how I really approached him in the end was, hey, I've got all these emails that your former customers have shared with me. I've talked to, your mentors, to professors, to everybody that I could find that knew anything or had any personal interactions with them. Why don't you tell me your side of the story? And so I think there was a part of him that probably was curious to find out what I knew. And there probably was some part, I'm only guessing, but that was maybe an attempt to steer me in a different direction, or to sort of stanch the bleeding. But I honestly, in the end, I always wonder, but I for some reason, I think, I have been personally surprised at, I mean, in my most recent book, I had people just openly confess to crimes that had been kept secret for decades. And they knew I was a journalist. They could see, I'm always very clear that I put a pretty ostentatious shotgun microphone between me and the subject so that they understand what this is. And yet they still do it. And part of it, I think, is that I'm really obsessive about my research. And so before I sit down with somebody, I have sort of hoovered up every scrap of information I can. And I've gone to the ends of the earth to try to understand them as well as I can. And I think that it's an unusual dynamic, but I think it gets people, I don't know, more chatty with me. I don't know if that makes sense, but in the end, this is all kind of a guess.
Do you think there was a point of pride in him in that he had pulled off this caper and these things were maybe even more valuable and he was more successful than he thought and it was something people hadn't done before? So does he have pride, do you think?
I think it's a possibility. There is a knee-jerk part of me that tries to resist like psychoanalyzing him, but
Yeah.
I think it's probably a little flattering too that a whole book is being written about him. I don't know, but these are all, even after, and I think I hint at this, I haven't read the book since I wrote it, but in the end, I remember doubling back on some of my assumptions and wondering whether or not I had just been played by him and that maybe he still has the missing birds and all of this. And so, this is not a world of like black and white. There's a lot of just uncertainty and points where I thought I knew something and then that would kind of dissolve in my hands. So, and Edwin is I think he's a gifted individual. He's usually the smartest person in the room. And I think that gets people in trouble when that's sort of how you proceed through life. And I think he usually is quite capable of outsmarting people, and he may have outsmarted me. I don't know, but there were plenty of things that I was kind of, I had to have a hell of a poker face to kind of hide my reaction to some of the things he was telling me. So,
do you think he's still tying flies?
I don't believe, if he is, I'm almost certain that he's not doing it for the community. He might be doing it sort of just for personal pleasure, but like the fly tying community has sort of, it's strange. I was going to say they threw him overboard and ostracized him, but that's not really true. I talked to a lot of guys that said they'd shake his hand and they'd be happy to welcome him back in. But I mean, he's certainly not, from what I can tell, posting, photos of his latest flies or anything like that. But it's so hard to imagine that he's completely given it up, given what kind of ordering force it was in his life, you know. Then again, he was staring down the barrel of a decade in prison, and so if anything's going to get you to bail on a destructive hobby, it might be that, you know.
Yeah, with the caveat that he didn't spend a decade in prison, and
yeah, it's a big caveat.
So, Kirk, I just this afternoon I was rereading about the interview, and I feel like there was a lot of arrogance from Edwin. I felt that he, was trying to have you. That's what I took away, and just particularly in that he kind of gave you the red carpet to Long to talk to Long, but on the backside he had called Long and said, "Kirk's not our friend. You know, don't disclose anything to him." But then Long was very earnest with you, and really, I feel like you really got through to him in the end.
I knew that the interview section in the book was going to be the one that drew the ornitologists and curator friends of mine to complete despair, because I knew I knew that he was full of excuses. He was blaming the museum for being poorly guarded. He was peddling this junk science that about DNA, and that these specimens aren't even useful anymore. And if they were, what's going on, guys? Like, why haven't you gotten on it or anything? And so I knew I had to include all of that as a way into his psychology and how he rationalized his crime. But I think, John, you were there when probably in Chicago when I spoke to that, whatever that, yeah.
The Society for Preservation of Natural History collections, which actually had folks from the Natural History Museum in attendance in Chicago.
And I wish there was a recording of it, because it was a pretty combative exchange. But the other curators in attendance, there were people crying when I was going through the sort of blow by blow of what happened. But I don't want to jump around, but even then, that was maybe that was with a year or less than a year after the book had come out. And even then, I think the museum was still, the Natural History Museum in the UK and in Tring were still, missing the forest for the trees, and still in damage control and reputational control. And they were basically, my recollection of it, and I took pretty lengthy notes right afterwards, was that they blamed the detectives for being kind of clueless and not recognizing. They claimed that they knew right away that it was Edwin. And this was somebody who introduced herself as speaking for the museum, and she was telling things in front of an audience of, I don't know how many, 500 plus people, that are demonstrably false. And they are proven false by the investigation of my own, and also by the police there. But where they were basically saying, we knew all along that it was fly tire, and yet it took 15 months for any arrest to be made. And the breakthrough tip, as you've probably gotten into in these podcasts, but it came from somebody outside the museum. It came from an undercover detective in the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So, I if I sound a little annoyed, it's just that, it's, I don't know if it's at the Field Museum, but for a while, the book was sold at every natural history museum I went to.
It's still in the Field Museum bookstore.
Okay, good for them. The only museum it apparently will never be present is the Natural History Museum in the UK. And they have, when I was in the UK on tour, there was some news program, or I don't remember what it was, but they were filming some, like, a profile on me, and they wanted to film me at the museum in Tring. And the response that they got was that under no circumstances is Kirk Johnson welcome at the museum.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
And it's a little, I mean, I now I kind of just can only chuckle about it, but they don't seem to recognize that this entire book is a love letter to their institution, and that I spent 5 years of my life trying to track down
Yeah.
their specimens to get them returned for them when they were doing nothing to track them down. And do I wish I had found all of them? Of course. But I mean, there are readers all over the world now that know about their mission and their function. There are natural history museums all over the world that have gotten increased funding as a result of the book for security and this type of thing. And so, at some point, maybe they will come around. It doesn't faze me. I'm not looking to be best friends with them or anything, but
the world has passed them by in more than one way. And the big way for me is that museums need to keep collecting and keep documenting biodiversity and keep studying it. And that institution isn't doing that nearly well enough anymore. And I know that sounds super critical, probably more critical than you're being, but and I view that as a falling down on what a fundamental mission should be of every natural history museum, is to keep documenting biodiversity, to not let birds die in vain, and to make sure they're preserved well enough for study. I mean, you can only be embarrassed so far before you have to turn it into something positive. So yeah, your book makes me weep. It did. And it also infuriated me so much that I couldn't sleep. But
sorry.
but what it does is it turns it around. It makes me even more committed to making sure that people are behind the scenes of our institution, so that they know why we have them. They can see them up close, understand their value.
Well, the one thing that I always come back to is that I've tried to have clarity of vision about the perpetrator and the victim here. And the museum was, in the end, the victim of all of this. They were not the most helpful victim when it came to obtaining justice, and that's not entirely their fault. And I don't, like we said at the top of this this discussion, like, I wouldn't want to have their job, where I'm sure they are faced with horrendous budget cuts, where they can't just charge $30 for admission like they should, like I wish they could, and like a lot of American institutions would. And but they, at the same time, there was a kind of strange hostility from them towards me that I can really, the most charitable I can view it is just that they can't see past their own reputation. And I think at some point when you're in a leadership position, you have to accept that you take some lumps here and there. But that same ethos is I think has been what guided the huge scandal at the British Museum, which led to the ouster of the head there. They had an inside curator that was stealing from them for decades, and they had outsiders tipping them off to it, and they said, we'll deal with this internally. And so there's a part where I don't want to kick them when they're down, but they're going to keep falling down if there isn't some kind of change.
But I would say that's a part of museum administration in every place I've ever been. Maybe it's true in all administration, that these kinds of people are in charge of places where reputation and pride are the only things they can see, not solving problems, supporting people, and moving forward. So I don't think it's all that unusual. And I think every once in a while you have to have a curator who's strong enough to say, look, we're not going to do this. We're not going to hold back the things. We're not going to pretend this didn't exist. We're going to talk about it, talk about why it happened and what we're going to do. So it's it's incumbent on us to make sure that people understand why we have so many specimens. And your book shows that really clearly. So that fly tying community, we'll never reach everybody, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It doesn't mean we should look at specimens like stamps that we keep in a drawer for only us to look at. And that's a dynamic tension I think every curator feels, this protection versus exposure dynamic that can be really hard. And a lot of curators see the collections as their own, which is good. It means you care for them, but it's bad. It means you don't let people use them.
Well, that's where I think Rick Prum played such a useful role in the book, just as the shoot from the hip American across the ocean, saying they should have been messianic about this and more clear about what happened, and reputation be damned.
You totally got his character too. Writing him. We've known Brick for a really long time, right? And I could hear his own voice coming through the way you were writing about what he was and his own mannerisms and behavior.
I love Rick. He told me I'm kind of I got him in trouble with his mom apparently for now everyone thinks he's this foul-mouthed ornithologist, but he kind of is. That's part of the appeal, so.
Circling back to what's going on in the UK, there's some additional ironies in that I was looking at something where Charles Darwin was arguing back in the 1880s that the botany collection at the British Museum, at the Natural History Museum, shouldn't be moved to Kew because he thought that it should be in London and people should be coming and looking at it in London. And they've made arrangements to basically take all the collections out of the Natural History Museum in London and send them to a facility in Reading. Now, the one thing that I think may happen with that is they may actually bring the bird collection from Tring. But, as you talk about in the book, I mean, one of the crazy things about Tring is it's off on its own in the countryside. And it's out of sight, out of mind in a lot of ways. And I think that's one of the most unfortunate things that I continue to argue about with anybody that'll listen to me in the U.S. with respect to working with these collections over time. I mean, if people can't get access to them easily, that's not going to help us with respect to keeping them front and center in people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like I don't know the sort of workings of how the budget works in the UK and from a parliamentary perspective, but a budget, any budget, I mean, Eisenhower was great in laying this out, but that any budget in the end it's a reflection, it's a statement of your country's values. And there's at some point, if these things are not given the support they need, then it's just they're not valued. It's really like, it's hard to, and this is the last thing I'll say that will sound hopefully not overly critical or cruel to the museum in Tring, but when I did go back on tour, I mean, we had to film like a kind of guerrilla interview where they would see me out and then some guard would come out and sort of whoosh me away or whatever. But I went up the back alley that Edwin had scaled the wall and the point of entrance. And in the couple years since I had last been there was a security camera up, except it was pointed in the wrong direction. It wasn't pointed at the alley. I was like, guys, you're so close here. But again, I don't know if that's, I don't know what goes into there. I can say all of this with the luxury of distance and ignorance about the amount of resources that they have. But it's I will just say that, I think I hint at this maybe in the epilogue of the book, but I'm now at 5 separate heists done by fly tyers at different natural history museums around the world. Edwin's, to my knowledge, is still the biggest one, but this is not an isolated event, and it's going to keep happening. And so I don't want to turn all of the museums into a bunker or anything, but you have to look clearly unencumbered by emotions or how you wish the world would be, and just assess what the dangers are and what you need to make sure that this collection can live on to the next generation.
I mean, for me, it highlights how important human relationships are, not just cameras being everywhere. But, in our institution, we rely on people who are walking the halls, other people we know who are in the collections. We rely on housekeeping to alert us if they were to find something, security who goes through the museum every night, making sure there's nobody there who shouldn't be there, and that there's no broken windows and things like that. So it really does take everybody, and the only way you accomplish that is through relationships.
Well, it's
And
it's funny, you're just making me think about it. You reminded me of a lighter moment, which is that one of the most tricky details from the night of the heist was he there alone?
yeah,
What was the size of the suitcase? How did he fit all the birds in? And John, I can't remember if I ever asked you this, but I certainly asked Rick. I asked John McCormick out here at Occidental, at the Moore Lab of Zoology. But at some point, and these are people that I know well, and I remember saying, like, can I just come into the collection with the suitcase and just let me just give me like an hour and just see how many birds I can fit? And it was just like a hard pass from from everyone. But it's even knowing that it was me and knowing what my intent was, I mean, it's like even a relationship can only get you so far. But I don't blame them.
the visuals of that would make me fall to the ground. It's just the very idea of doing that.
I know.
At the same time, we could speculate on. I mean, we do a lot of loan processing, so it's not like the specimens don't leave the collection sometimes, going to other institutions, and it's amazing how packable specimens are. Maybe not resplendent quetzals.
Certainly the Katingas, though, right? Like those are tiny little.
Yeah, you can
fit a lot of those in carry-on luggage.
And that was 98 of the 299, I think. So.
Yeah, and they're prepped in a way that can line them up,
and they can be flattened too, right? So you can, they're not made of steel; it's cotton inside of them, so you can layer a lot. Here we are giving people clues to the fact that they could take a smaller suitcase into a museum if they're going to start stealing things.
So I just want to point out, I don't know if you remember this story, Kirk, but my first interaction with you was you were in Rick's office, and you guys called me because you'd found a picture on one of the websites of birds from our collection.
Were they starlings? I'm trying to remember what they were. Tanagers.
They were tanagers. Right. And my heart just sunk and when I saw the picture, and it sunk even more because I could see they were collected by a graduate student of mine not that long ago. And so I just was in an absolute panic when I went down to the collection, opened up the case that they were supposed to be in, and they were sitting there. And no, it's like
a lot of apologizing.
I think it's no, it was just like I just and again, we should lose sleep over that. That's yeah.
But that was one
again,
thing that I think a lot of readers, I had to kind of disabuse them of this idea of like, well, that you could have visibility into the status of hundreds of thousands or a million specimens. It's like I had to kind of, so many people in the audience would say, like, how could it take them over a month to realize that they had been robbed? And that's one thing where I've had to routinely kind of say, it's totally understandable. With the big asterisk that if they had cared about Alfred Russel Wallace as much as they cared about Darwin, they would have checked on Wallace's birds that day as well. That's my only, and just not to take us in a different direction, but one of the great joys of this book personally was that when I was in the UK on tour, I built an extra day into the schedule, and I went down and spent the day with Alfred Russel Wallace's 93-year-old grandson.
Wow.
And none of his neighbors knew who he was. and he had all these sort of, I don't know if they were, daguerreotypes or what, but these photos of Wallace that I had never seen in all of my obsessive searching. And we had a kind of we had a kind of simple lunch, and then I said I can't resist asking, but do you have anything of your grandpa's here, or are they all in museums somewhere? And he brought me down the hallway to this spare bedroom where all I remember was that there was just a dresser in it, and he's like, open the bottom drawer, and the first thing I saw was this thick sheaf of correspondence, and there were Darwin letters in there. There were just sitting in the drawer. And he said, look underneath there, and there was the pocket watch that he saved from the burning boat.
Wow.
And his field glasses that he sighted the birds of paradise through for the very first time. It had his initials carved on it. And I went out into the backyard, and I'm peering through this thing
Wow.
at birds, and I was sort of just kind of overwhelmed by the moment. And I sat down on this old bench in the backyard that was just getting, rained on and snowed on every year. And Wallace's grandson came out and said, "Oh yeah, my Alfred made that bench while he was writing the Malay Archipelago, and he would sit out there and so it was just this really kind of magical connection to the past, to these things that I've been writing about, and he has since passed away. But those, I made sure, because I'm now friends with the family, but I made sure that all of that stuff is in good hands and being taken care of by his other descendants now, by the next generation. So
I feel like that at the University of Chicago. Every time I go into one of the oldest buildings, a seminary building in particular, and the steps are worn in the middle, and I just think of how many people's feet have gone through the, centuries now up and down those stairs. And
yep, I know those steps well, and I've spent most of my time at the Oriental Institute right nearby, but same thing.
Kirk, so prior to writing the book, I was just curious because you do such an amazing job of just like weaving in all of these different details, going from Wallace to the Rothschilds, and it's just like so well researched. And I was just curious, like before you were in the river learning about the story of Edwin Rist, like how much of a knowledge did you have on, collections, on Wallace, on any of this? Because I just love how deep you get into each of those. It was like each chapter was like a new surprise that you get to learn so much about it. And I was just curious, like, it's so impressive how much in depth you went into all of it. If you had any prior knowledge to it, or if these were all things that you kind of dove into just through writing the book.
Oh, thanks. It's a nice thing to say. The simple answer is I was a complete dimwit. I had I was not a birder. I had a if it was above average, then average has been defined down in a very major way. So I couldn't rattle off like a bunch of different species. And so I had a kind of embarrassing starting point, but I have come to view that as a great asset when you're going into an investigation. In that, I say this to my kids: the worst thing you could do is pretend you know something you don't know. It's just, you can almost see the walls go up, and to prevent knowledge from coming in. And so I ask impossibly stupid questions to some of the finest sort of ornithological minds alive.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yes.
What do you mean?
But I was also, I guess, in some ways, a representative of my readers, that none of us knew about any of this stuff. And I think for most people, the thing flapping by is just a bird. A museum is just like, well, we said earlier, it's just what you see on the field trip, and you kind of forget about in the decades that follow, when life kind of takes over. And so I had a vague memory of Wallace in terms of the kind of underdog aspect, and sort of not, understanding that he didn't get as much credit or as much of the glory as Darwin did, but it was a massive undertaking where at the beginning, I just started making these, what I kind of think of as, lakes and ponds and rivers of knowledge that I would need to fill and figure out how they connect to each other. And so it was just, tons of biographies, I mean, there must be, I would guess between 10 and 20,000 pages of transcripts of interviews that I did with not just fly tyers, but with ornithologists, with biologists, with all of this, with ichthyologists. And there's something that, I don't know if you know about, but Tom Wolfe always wore this like very sort of flashy white 3-piece suit, and it made him look like kind of a dandy. But part of why he did that was it signaled to whoever he was talking to that he was not part of their group. And so when he went down to like write about NASCAR or something, he could ask a question that without worrying about his pride or anything. Why does it work like this? Why is this the case? And sometimes those are the easiest questions, but they're questions that like a curator hasn't been asked in decades, or maybe they've never really thought about why things are the way they are. And so I've come to view that as an asset, but obviously it's a good starting point, but you can never end that way. It was a really like, and the other thing is that I writing for an American audience, I'm aware of how allergic we are to history or history lessons. And so one of the hardest things to write in that book was the chapters that sort of established the historical background to all of this, the why these birds were collected, why they were so important, because without knowing that, this just is a quirky little magazine piece, a quirky crime about an obsessive kid that stole something bright and shiny. But if I could somehow write the history and find enough sort of glimmering moments from history to keep the reader going forward, enough to lodge this in them, I wanted you to feel like a real gut punch when they pulled the drawer open and found it was empty. Like that, I wanted you to feel how big that loss was. And so, there are some little anecdotes in there that to me were such a godsend, because it was a way of like hopefully making these past episodes exciting. Like one of my favorite things, which is just it doesn't explain the importance of the collections, but it was somewhere in Greece, but there's that one quick little vignette of World War I, I think, and a mortar blows open a crypt, and they find a bunch of ancient hooks in there, and then they use these tied some feathers to these hooks, and then they caught like 1,000 fish or whatever to feed the troops. And there was just something that was so fantastical about that image, but also did the work of like connecting us to the past, showing that some things, for all that the world's changed, that it hasn't changed that much. I don't know if I'm making any sense right now.
Yeah.
No,
So for me, the lasting heartache is that they cut the tags off of the skins. To me, that's the worst sin that you would do that you would cut the tags off of the skins and separate those things.
So there's a crazy irony in our collection, and when you get here, I'll show it to you at some point, is that we have a greater bird of paradise in the drawers that I often describe to people as one of my favorite birds in the collection. And when you look at the tag, what it says on it, it says, "Old specimen collected by Wallace, Aru Islands." And I like to point out to people, because everybody gets excited when they see the word Wallace on there, that he didn't even write that whatever's going on with that specimen. And as a matter of fact, Paul Sweet, who's the collection manager at the AMNH, when I started talking about this, because we got it on exchange from the AMNH, was like, "Why did we give that up? It says Wallace on it." And it's like, because there's no data that says Wallace actually collected it. Somebody else wrote it, and he
It could
probably
have been his
did,
assistant
but we don't
Ali
know.
or whatever. I think did you bring that to the event? I think you showed me that specimen.
I might have, maybe I
Um,
did. Yeah, it's just but it's just such an example of tags and the associated information, as Shannon's saying, that is like so critical with everything, and that tells a great story in this sense, but it's not the same as telling you which locality that red rough fruit grow came from.
yeah, and that's another one of those things that um, comes up regularly in from the audience. It's like, well, why don't they just photograph the tag with the specimen? Why is this so crucial? And I have to then walk them through like how many years that would take and how much money they would need for that. And then even then it's like, um, the most trained eyes, I'm sure if you had 10 specimens gathered within 30 years of each other in the 1800s and you had the 10 tags, you couldn't put that puzzle back together again, right?
Well,
Right.
these days we might be able to a little bit because North American birds are getting so much smaller over the last 40 years that you can't tell you exactly, but we might be able to tell you to which few years a specimen actually came from by its measurements. So that's how fast we're changing the evolutionary landscape for birds. So,
Oh, that's
but
interesting.
yeah. uh, So I don't know how much variation there is, and we don't have enough specimens from back then in many species to even start charting the kind of changes that we might have in uh, over 200 years now. But uh, that's why we keep them, is because in 100 years, people are going to be able to come into our collections and do something they can't do anywhere else in the world, which is look at common North American species that have smashed themselves into windows in Chicago and gotten smaller. And do they keep getting smaller? Biology is about statistics. You need enough um, to say with any confidence what you believe.
I did, by the way, it didn't factor into the book at all, but I had read all of these sort of Victorian era guides on how to prep a bird. And I told John McCormick out at Occidental here, like, can I come do one? I want to see what the process is. And he let me come into the lab, and there was some window kill from somewhere on the East Coast, some cowbird or something like that. I don't know. I don't even remember what it was. And it was like they were all gathered around, and they were, I was asking these, like, can I squeeze the eyeballs? I want to see, like, I read this, and it's just like, I was going hardcore nerdy about it, but I just wanted to see like what it was like, and also it allowed me to kind of appreciate what an art form it is, like how easy it is to do it wrong, and how important it is to
You
get
need to
right.
bring your kids to Chicago on members nights, because
Oh, that'd be
for
fun.
2 days every year we open up behind the scenes, and you can come behind the scenes, and we always have people preparing specimens at that
Oh,
time
that's
so that
cool.
you can look up close and see that what you see is not like a horror show or a TV crime thing. It's, there's not blood squirting out of their eyes and stuff like that, um but you can get a feel for what it's like.
It's funny because there's my my kids are 8 and 7 years old, and um I accompanied their class field trip to the Natural History Museum here in LA, and I obviously know everyone there, and so they were giving me or they were giving the class kind of behind the scenes access, and like my son was like, "What's going on? Like, why is everyone like talking to you this way?" And then later that week, I was in an Orvis shop because I was getting a new fly rod, and some clerk came up and asked me if I was Kirk Johnson, and he's
Cool.
my son August was like, "What is happening?" I was like, "Buddy, your daddy's famous in two places, in a fly
Fly
shop and
shops
in a
and
natural history museum. That's it. Everywhere else, like I'm a nobody." But so he'd be very proud to come to the Field Museum. I'll take you up on it.
Yeah, I mean, you can watch how looking at things up close like that can transform people. And we should be helping to transform people, because if we want to save the earth, they have to have kind of an emotional reaction to biodiversity, or we're completely sunk. It can't just be that they're worried about their own survival, because then they'll do all these crazy things, spend all this money on carbon capture and the places that are interesting scientifically, but you have to like bring it down to, why do we care about the planet? Why do we care about people? Why do we care about birds? Why do we care about these things?
One of the happiest sort of things about that I've experienced from the book is so many people that have become birders as a result of it, or have taken up fly fishing as a result of it, because both of those things require engaging with a part of our brain that is lost to most people now in modern life, and they require slowing down, and they require discipline and the brute force of study and training and memorization in these things. And you can use, like, I use the Merlin app way more than I should, because I know it's keeping me from just doing the work of just putting the time in with field guides and memorizing it in a deeper way than just, oh, here, I just have to press these 5 different steps or whatever, and I've got the bird. And I look, and I've like identified that same bird like 37 times before. So I'm not bragging about being like more advanced than I am, but I think those two parts have had an increased role in my life, and they just require a kind of slowing down that I think is has the effect that you're talking about, of connecting us to the planet in some deeper level than how we're currently experiencing it.
Did writing this book change the way you looked at books and your research that came afterward?
Yes, yeah, in a well, in some ways it it was a kind of defining experience for me, because I had never seen myself as an investigative reporter. I didn't see myself as even really a nonfiction author. I discovered this story while I was supposed to be writing my first book, which was a memoir, which accesses a very different part of your brain. It's more of a interrogation with your memory than it is. I mean, I didn't have to do hundreds or 1,000 interviews for that book. And so and so that was this, it took me years of convincing myself that I had the right to write this book, because I was full of self-doubt. I felt like an interloper. I felt like I had a kind of identity that had already been defined for me as a refugee advocate and as somebody who had been through the war and all of this stuff. But this story kept kind of beckoning to me that it was a way of kind of exploring something new. And in doing that, it forced me to, like, I felt silly reaching out to Rick Prum the first time. How was I even going to introduce myself to him? Why on earth should he spend any time with me? And so it was just, uh, but everything just kind of gathered this momentum, and it wasn't. But I think the proposal that I wrote to get the book deal was over 80 pages long. And I'd already gone to the UK for research. It was all just sort of, I'm not ready yet. I don't think I can do this yet. I don't think I can do it. And then when I got the book deal, and it was a pretty public deal, because uh, there were a lot of there was a lot of every publisher wanted it. And I was selling foreign languages before I had written the first paragraph. That's when the mood changed from one of like, okay, I can do this, to like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? How, how am I going to do this? I've just conned my way into a book deal, and I don't even know if anyone's going to talk to me or anything. But but in terms of like my subsequent projects, I mean, my last book, my most recent book, was a story about a clash between Vietnamese refugees and the Ku Klux Klan along the Texas Gulf Coast in the early 80s. It's a heavy book, and it does, similar to Feather Thief in a way, it does deal with our relationship to the planet and to natural resources and to the destruction of ecosystems. But it's a story of white supremacy in a very unexpected place. But it took everything out of me writing that book because of the subject matter. And of course, I wrote it during the pandemic, so I'm sure that didn't help, because I had to write it between 8 at night when my kids were asleep and about 5 in the morning for 2 years or so. But the only reason I'm mentioning all of that is I think The Feather Thief is, in some ways, it's an escapist read. It's not escapist for you all, given what you do for your day job, but for the average reader, this is just bringing them into a world they've never heard of, but it hopefully, wrestles with something more important at the same time. But if I have to go give a talk to an audience about The Feather Thief versus a talk to an audience about The Fisherman and the Dragon, my more recent book, one of them, when I get home at night, I'm in a real happy, upbeat mood, and the other one, I just want to go to bed because it takes everything out of me. So so that in some ways, I feel endlessly lucky to have discovered this story, and it really does. I think it just came out, and maybe, I think, like about its 15th language or so. It just came out in Russian. It's still selling all over the world. It's like people are. I get emails every single day from readers that have just discovered it, and so that has been like a true joy, just seeing that like such an unlikely story has had this kind of life, if that makes sense.
I mean, to me, when you go through your own journey at the beginning of the book, it you did something really courageous for yourself, right? Really taking a chance on yourself to be vulnerable, to say, "I don't know." And that's, to me, that's why I like spending so much time with children, because they don't care. They're gonna ask you a question. They're gonna demand that you tell them how it works, um, without preconceived ideas or embarrassment. They just do. And so
Yeah, and they
to
can be relentless. Like, nothing has, talking about kids, I mean, nothing has humbled me more than when my kids ask me why. Just 3 letters. And it usually, if you think back to any body of knowledge, usually you can, if you're smart, you can answer the first order, you can give some explanation, but then if they ask you why, you're usually hopeless. Unless you spent your life, I mean, my daughter asked me why the sky was blue the other week, and I knew that at some point, and I was just like, I don't know,
Yeah.
sweetie, I can't remember, and they ask me that all the time, and it's like it's a superpower to ask that question, because
My
I'd also,
mom said I did that. I used to ask why, and she said she was exhausted by me. And eventually people would just say, "It just is. Can't you just, it just is."
yes, and I think part of curiosity is just never accepting that, right? And to just keep probing and keep pushing, and there's a lot of, we all are born into systems norms and routines and we inherit those as sort of like, this is the way that Earth is, and this is why things are the way they are. And they're obviously fragile, and they're subject to change or to manipulation or exploitation. And so why do natural history museums operate this way? It sounds like a silly question. And they're like, there's some good answers, and there's some answers that are more just inertia and might need to be revisited. But it's not just that. It's why, like, how many hours did Rick Prum spend with me where I'm just asking, yeah, but why did that tail feather turn that way? And he was incredibly patient with me, and just,
It's not patience. We love telling people what we do and why we do it. I mean, I'm not joking.
no, I
because you
believe
could-
you. You don't know how many hours I spent with them in each session. So there was an element of patience there.
You never know where a good idea for a next science project is going to come from. And they often come from the strangest, least likely, weirdest things that you end up finding yourself in. And all of a sudden you connect a whole bunch of dots, and there you go. You're doing something that you didn't do before. And you're not going to do that on your own. This is inherently a social endeavor with a lot of different kinds of people feeding ideas into the mix, and they kind of form their own pieces of art in their own individual and unique ways. That's where science projects come from. They don't come out of my brain.
In a way, that's how this book came about. It was just an accidental. If I had chosen the next result in Google for a fly fishing guide in New Mexico, I would have never heard the story. If I hadn't glimpsed the salmon fly in his fly box, I would have never written the story. And just by the way, that guide, Spencer Syme, twice had to go to law enforcement for death threats that he received from people within the community for the sin of telling me the story in the first place.
Oh no.
And he has been disinvited from the kind of main fly tying festivals for a period of time, saying that he's not welcome, and certainly not tying with substitutes is not welcome. And so, I mean, that pissed me off, obviously. But he also has people from all over the world that fly to New Mexico now just to book of the feather thief package that he sells. To basically, He takes them to the spot on the river where he first told me the story, and he teaches people how to tie substitute feathers with dyed feathers.
Good
and
for
stuff.
him.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
So you just went to the why question that I have, which is that why hasn't the fly tying community been able to go the route of saying, wow, who can come closest to these Victorian flies using absolutely legal material? I mean, it just doesn't. That's the thing that bothers me the most.
Well, likewise, I think this is my simplest answer, is that most of these guys have spent obscene amounts of money, in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars over decades, to get these feathers. And so from from the simple perspective of investment bias, in for a dime, in for a dollar, that the last thing that these guys want to do is render those invaluable feathers worthless by now tying with turkey and chicken feathers. That was the whole thing. That's the whole status. That's how you reach the mountaintop in this community.
It's a cult, and they're insular in that way.
Well, certainly the way that they've responded to me and now to Spencer. I mean, I didn't expect them to embrace me or the book or anything, but the two groups that responded with the greatest hostility were fly tyers and the Natural History Museum in Tring. But they are. I mean, I had sources that were calling me from fly tying shows right before the book came out, where they were hearing people saying, we got to sell our stuff before the book comes out and before the feds descend on all of this. to this day, I cannot think of another hobby that so quickly drives its adherents into criminality than Victorian salmon fly tying. And so from a practical perspective, like, you know, of course they should be just shifting to these, like, to the naked eye, you cannot tell the difference. The dyeing, there are some like master dyers now that you can't even tell the difference between a red ruffed fruit crow and a dyed chicken feather. Um, but it's just, this is so bound up in status and the in group versus the out group, and all of this kind of core base human instincts that are not unique to this group. All of us share that in some form or another. All of us make moral compromises because of the things that we covet. And some of them are minor, some of them aren't. Like I have an iPhone like everyone else. I know it's using rare metals that are being extracted to great ecological destruction all over the world. I know that at times they've probably been assembled with child labor. Um, that's just an unpleasant splinter in my foot. That once you're aware of it, you either like make a change or not. And we don't always make those changes. And so there are times where I think of this group as completely foreign and strange and cult like. And then there are times where I'm like, every single person who picks this book up, every single human alive belongs to at some point on the spectrum. And all of us have some kind of blind spot. Now, we're not climbing museum walls, but there are things that obsession or desire or insecurity or whatever, I think drives us to a kind of myopia at points. And I think it's like the best you can do is try to be aware of it at least. But this is obviously an extreme example of it all.
Yep. I put it up there with elephant poaching and getting rhino horn, but you're right. I mean, it is a spectrum.
You earlier on mentioned some other thefts from museums. Was there anything else that you came across when researching that shocked you as much as this, or was close?
Well, I mean, I can't remember what's in the book, but I know of two thefts that happened, if I recall, they were prior to the Tring heist. European, like mainland Europe, the institutions, and in that instance it was an American fly tyer that had landed a gig as a pest control operator, and he was taping tens of thousands of dollars of birds into his sort of overalls while spraying for mites or whatever. I knew the identity I know the guy's name, and I can't remember all of the twists and turns, but there was some kind of forbearance or leniency that was given him because he had a late stage cancer diagnosis. And so they just sort of let nature render its verdict, so to speak. John, I think we were on one chain. I won't go into details, but an American institution where it had fallen into kind of a lack of oversight at a university, and there was a grad student there selling birds on eBay. And I don't think there were ever charges brought. I don't know that was just something that was just swept under the institutional rug, basically. And that one I had to wrestle with whether or not I was going to say anything about it, but it also it was so clear that like the damage was done already. Even at the LA Natural History Museum, which hosted the sort of first launch of the book on the tour, they gave me a tour shortly before the event, and they showed me crowbar marks where somebody had pried open a case there, and the same species of bird stolen, and that they have as what's in the book. There were Katingas. I think there was a in that case, I think there were a cock of the rock or something. And they never found it. They never found any it took too long, I think, or they don't even know when it happened. And so there was a kind of the number of instances where you're like, okay, this is not a blip. The market is as pitched as ever. There's another project that I'm kind of I've just been doing research, and it's not, I don't know if it's a book or what yet, but there's pretty rampant criminality in the world of vintage baseball cards and sports memorabilia. There's like just an obscene amount of heists and just armed robberies and things like that. And there are, small town museums all over the country that have, priceless memorabilia, and they don't have any funding for security. And so there was like a crime family in Pennsylvania that did a dozen museum heists up and down the East Coast, and they Christy Mathewson's jersey, Yogi Berra's championship rings, all that stuff just gone now forever. And so it's as crazy as it is in terms of these specimens, it's not unique to that. And there really are just like, you can only steal these things once before they're gone forever, and so that's the kind of thing that's just underscores the tragedy of it all.
I still think, to me, one of the most important, the repurposing with respect to the specimens into fish fly ties is just, that is one of the, for all the various reasons we've been talking about. So Christy Matheson's jersey may show up someplace else because that's the only reason it has any value at some level. But, I always tell people, there's a point in the book where you talk to one of the fish fly tiers and they're saying, well, they weren't using them, so we did.
Yeah, they view that as a kind of moral justification, that they appreciate these things more than you all do. And let us marvel in their beauty. And it's tough to say, but there is a kind of strange, it's not a perfect overlap, but they can go the distance on these species and their love of them, but they love them for a very different reason than the scientific community does. But there were times where I would be in an interview with a fly tyer, and they would be talking at length about the distribution, the deep history of the red ruffed fruit crow. And it sounded like I was talking to an ornithologist, but they were talking about it in terms of how to get their hands on it,
Yeah.
I need to send you a Google search I was doing where I typed in the words Edwin Rist, and I took a screenshot of it because up came Edwin Rist, American ornithologist.
Oh boy. Yeah, that's I guess AI run amok there. I don't know what that is. Well, yeah.
So the hope, the only hopeful thing there is that somebody said to me, well, maybe they were looking at the search engine was looking at the fact that you search for ornithologists all the time, and that's why they actually attributed that. I'm not going to be that charitable with respect to.
Well, if you don't use my middle name, most of the Kirk Johnsons that pop up are, they're mug shots, so I wouldn't put too much stock into all that.
Kirk, I kind of going back to how the fly tyers view feathers differently. I just reread today how you went to Norway to interview Long, and I was struck how you repeatedly checked in with him to ask, have you sent your, book, your album of feathers back? And it was several times. It was no, not yet, haven't gotten to it, even though he was morally struggling. And then it sounds like he finally did at the end. But I was going back to what you were saying, John, about why hasn't the fly tyer community tried to, introduce sustainability, and it sounds like Long tried to and was fully rejected, like by the community. Like they didn't want anything. They viewed that as a inauthentic pursuit.
Yes. Yeah. And to my knowledge, because I mean, people send me photos and links all the time. But to my knowledge, he's now fully back to just tying the classic way. With
Oh no.
yeah. So he's back to the sort of status quo ante. But
Oh no.
but yeah. And I had to get the confirmation from Long, and then I had to write. I don't know if it took one or two nudges, but the museum never told me they never told me that they got anything back.
Oh wow.
And so not until I pressed them, but I was sort of like, all right, well, I'm not looking for a
Pat on the back.
for you to set up a bunch of fireworks or whatever, but like.
Yeah, I was gonna say, would they have told you?
I don't know, but it was, guys, like I'm on your side here.
Right.
But no, there was no profound change. I think it just made them more suspicious of any outsiders and risks that somebody like me might pose. And the main forum in the book is now completely, it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. And so yeah. But one last thing, and then I have to hop on a call. But I was speaking at one event on tour, and it was an unusual situation where they, like a lot of times there'll be like a signing line where people want me to like autograph the book or whatever, or make it out to a friend of theirs, whatever. And for whatever reason, they did the signing line before the event. And there's this long line, and the last person in the line sets down a salmon fly in front of me. And I've obviously seen plenty of salmon flies, so I kind of looked. I wasn't that impressed, but he's like, turn it over, and it was one sign. It was a fly tied by Edwin Rist.
Oh wow.
And I said, oh well, where's this? Where'd you get this from? And he's like, I'm his uncle. And then my handler said, okay, Kirk, we have to bring you up to stage now. and the first 5 minutes of this event, I was like looking for him in the audience.
Yeah,
my wife was like worried that I was, after everything I've been through in life, that I was going to get, that the fly tying community was going to take a hit out on me or something. And it was really throwing me off because I couldn't tell what his intentions were. And and so I actually like interrupted my talk, and I asked him to raise his hand, and I was like, all right, if you see like a red laser, if I drop during this talk, this is the guy that did it. And like he started laughing, but I went out to dinner with him after the event, and it was a kind of shocking discussion that I can't get into too many details, but he illuminated a lot more about what went on, but also he told me I was too charitable and too I went too easy on Edwin. I didn't feel in the end that it was. I'm not trying to anoint myself like some judge in all of this. I don't. Some people get frustrated that I didn't get to the conclusive, like this is where every single last bird is, or that I don't definitively put my finger on one scale or the other. But I felt like the only form, however you view the justice or the lack of justice in the British system in this case, I felt like at a minimum the story deserved to be told and bolted down and preserved, and that you shouldn't be able to do something this heinous and then nobody ever finds out about it. And so that really that's what was animating me all along. But by the end, I think it was in the book, but I kept getting tipped off to other sort of ornithological crimes or museum heists, and my wife was like, "Is this it now? Like, is this what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life?" And so
our lives, yeah.
And so I'm so like delighted that people have discovered the book, but I know it's gonna forever be like an unfolding story. So even though I feel like I'm done with it, I'm not. Like I still constantly am getting tips, and I'm rooting around to see if I can still find them. So
Do you think you could ever get his uncle to go on the record with you?
I don't know. It's a good question. But the I also really felt at some point that like what I learned from him was illuminating, but it wasn't a fundamentally different story than what you read in the book, if that makes sense.
Got it.
And
Yeah.
so the book still kind of, I think, accurately speaks for itself. So
That's awesome.
Well, Kirk,
That's
I know
an awesome
you've got to
story.
take off soon. So we just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on. This has been so wonderful, and you've been so kind with your time to come on and talk with us. So thank you so much.
oh, thank you all.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
really flattered you read the book and are having such great conversations about it. So so really thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.